The cafeteria of Zephyr Station buzzed with its usual midday chaos. Students from dozens of species gathered around tables, their conversations creating a symphony of clicks, whistles, and harmonic tones that would have sounded alien to Earth ears. The massive space station served as a premier educational facility for the Galactic Federation's youth, bringing together the brightest minds from across known space. Kira sat alone at a corner table, her pale blue skin marking her as one of the Aqualians from the water world of Nereid Prime. Her large, dark eyes darted nervously around the room as she picked at her specially prepared kelp salad. Being new to the station was hard enough, but being from a recently contacted species made everything infinitely more difficult. The Aqualians had only joined the Federation 3 cycles ago, after their homeworld's first contact protocols were finally completed. Kira was among the first exchange students from her world, selected for her exceptional aptitude in xenobiology and her family's political connections. What the selection committee hadn't mentioned was how isolated she would feel among species that had been part of the galactic community for centuries. 3 tables away, Marcus Chun finished his synthetic protein bar and glanced around the cafeteria. The human exchange student had been on Zephyr Station for 2 months now, long enough to understand the complex social dynamics that played out daily in this melting pot of galactic civilization. His brown eyes noticed the solitary figure in the corner, the way other students seemed to unconsciously avoid her section of the cafeteria. Humans were still relatively new to the galactic stage themselves, having achieved faster-than-light travel only 15 years ago. Their admission to the Federation had been controversial, with many established species viewing them as too aggressive, too unpredictable. Marcus had heard all the whispers, felt the suspicious glances. But at least humans had proven themselves in several conflicts and had earned a grudging respect. The Aqualians had no such reputation to shield them. A commotion near the food dispensers caught Marcus's attention. 3 Vorthan students, their tall frames and crystalline skin marking them as one of the Federation's founding species, were surrounding someone. The Vorthans were known for their technological prowess and their unfortunately common superiority complex when dealing with primitive species. "Look what we have here," sneered Zektar, the tallest of the 3. His voice carried the harmonic undertones typical of his species, but there was nothing melodious about his tone. The little fish girl, all alone again. "Where are your shoal mates, water breather?" Kira pressed herself back against the wall, her food tray clutched protectively against her chest. "Please, I just want to eat in peace," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her translator device struggled with her species' natural underwater communication patterns, making her words sound stilted and artificial. "Peace." Relcon, the 2nd Vorthan, laughed with a sound like breaking glass. "This is a civilized station. Primitive species don't get to demand peace. They get what they're given." The 3rd Vorthan, Mestak, reached out with one crystalline finger and flicked Kira's tray. The specially prepared food scattered across the floor, the carefully balanced nutrients that her physiology required now spread in a disgusting mess on the deck plating. Several students from nearby tables turned to look, but none made any move to intervene. This kind of harassment had become disturbingly common, and most students had learned to keep their heads down. "Oops," Mestak said with mock concern. "How clumsy of you, fish girl. Better clean that up before it attracts scavengers." Kira stared at her ruined meal, her large eyes beginning to well up with the saline tears that were one of the few things her species shared with many others. The specialized food had cost her nearly a week's allowance, and the next shipment from the Aqualian Dietary Services wouldn't arrive for another 5 days. She would have to survive on the basic nutrient paste that barely met her species' requirements. "I say clean it up." Zektar's voice took on a harder edge. "Use your hands like the primitive you are. Maybe if you're lucky, we'll let you lick it off the floor afterward. I'm sure that's more civilized than whatever you did on your mudball world." Marcus felt something cold and familiar settle in his stomach. He'd seen this before, on Earth, in the schoolyards and streets of his youth. Bullies were apparently a universal constant, regardless of species or technological advancement. But there was something else, something that made his jaw clench and his hands form unconscious fists. The human had spent his early years in foster care, bouncing between homes where bigger kids thought they could take advantage of the quiet Asian boy. He learned early that sometimes the only way to stop a bully was to show them that their target could bite back. The scars on his knuckles and the slight bend in his nose were testaments to those hard-learned lessons. But this was different. This wasn't just some playground scuffle. This was systematic persecution based on species, the kind of thinking that had led to some of humanity's darkest chapters. And watching this girl, this Kira, being forced to grovel on the floor for the amusement of these crystalline bastards brought back every memory of injustice he'd ever witnessed. The Vorthons were tall, probably close to 7 feet each, with natural armor plating that made them formidable opponents. They were stronger than humans, faster in many ways, and their crystalline biology gave them advantages that baseline humans couldn't match. In a fair fight, Marcus would be at a significant disadvantage. Good thing he'd never believed in fair fights. Marcus stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the suddenly quiet section of the cafeteria. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small bottle of synthesized earth beer, one of the few luxuries he'd managed to acquire through trading his humanities music collection to a Centaurian merchant. Several students had begun to notice the confrontation now, their conversations dying away as they sensed the tension building. The Vorthons were so focused on their victim that they hadn't yet noticed the human approaching. Marcus took a long look at Kira, still kneeling on the floor, trying to gather the scattered remains of her meal with trembling hands. Her blue skin had darkened with what he recognized as the Aqualian equivalent of a blush, the shame and humiliation radiating from her in waves. He thought about his sister back on Earth, about the time he'd found her crying in her room after older kids had knocked her books into a mud puddle. He thought about Mr. Kawaii, the elderly Japanese man who'd been shoved around by teenage thugs until Marcus had finally stepped in. He thought about every time he'd walked away from injustice because it wasn't his problem, wasn't his fight. Not this time. Marcus set the beer bottle on the nearest table with a deliberate clink that finally drew the Vorthon's attention. When Zektar turned around, his crystalline features twisted into a sneer of contempt. "And what do you want, mammal? Come to watch the show." Marcus looked down at Kira, who was staring up at him with those large, dark eyes filled with fear and desperate hope. Then he looked back at the 3 Vorthons, his expression calm and utterly without fear. "Hold my beer," he said quietly. The cafeteria had gone completely silent. Even the normal background hum of the station's environmental systems seemed muted as I turned toward the confrontation unfolding near the corner table. Students from a dozen different species watched with the fascinated horror of those witnessing something they knew would become legend. Zektar's crystalline features shifted through several colors, a sign of confusion among his people. The phrase "hold my beer" had no direct translation in most galactic languages, and even the universal translators seemed to struggle with the cultural context behind the human's words. "I asked you a question, soft skin," Zektar said, his voice carrying the harmonics of barely controlled aggression. "Are you here to join the entertainment, or just too stupid to mind your own business?" Marcus stepped closer, and several students instinctively moved back. There was something about the human's movement, a predatory grace that spoke of violence held in check. His dark eyes never left Zektar's face, and his expression remained eerily calm. "I'm here to suggest you find somewhere else to be," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent cafeteria. "The lady is trying to eat her lunch in peace." Relcon laughed, the sound like crystal chimes in a windstorm. "Lady? It's barely evolved past breathing water. And you?" He looked Marcus up and down dismissively. "You're from that barbaric little world that just learned to leave its own system. Terra, wasn't it? The planet of hairless apes." "Earth," Marcus corrected mildly. "And yes, we're relatively new to the neighborhood, but we've picked up a few habits along the way. One of them is a deep dislike for bullies." Mestak moved to Marcus's left, trying to flank him. The movement was subtle, practiced, These three had clearly done this before, used their size and numbers to intimidate others into submission. But Marcus had grown up in neighborhoods where 3-on-1 wasn't unusual odds, and his body language didn't change even as he tracked the Vorthin's movement with his peripheral vision. Bullies. Zektar's skin shifted to an angry red. We are Vorthins, founders of the Federation, masters of technology that your primitive species can't even comprehend. We don't bully. We simply recognize the natural hierarchy of civilized space. Kira was still on the floor, her scattered food forgotten as she watched the exchange with growing horror. She had heard about humans, of course, the new species that had fought the hegemony to a standstill, that had somehow survived first contact with some of the galaxy's most dangerous predator species. But she had never spoken to one, never been this close to one. Looking at Marcus now, she could see what the other species found so unsettling about humans. There was something in his eyes, something that suggested violence was always just beneath the surface, waiting to be unleashed. But it wasn't the mindless aggression that many species attributed to humanity. This was controlled, purposeful. This was a predator that thought before it struck. Natural hierarchy, Marcus repeated, rolling the words around like he was tasting something unpleasant. See, that's where we're going to have a problem. Because where I come from, we have a saying, the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. He took another step forward, close enough now that Zektar had to look down to maintain eye contact. The height difference was significant, but somehow Marcus's presence seemed to fill the space between them. And I've been doing nothing for too long. The next few seconds stretched like hours. Students throughout the cafeteria held their breath, waiting to see what would happen when an unstoppable force met an immovable object. The Vorthins were known for their physical superiority, their advanced technology, their unshakable belief in their own supremacy. Humans were known for their unpredictability, their refusal to acknowledge when they were outmatched, their disturbing tendency to escalate conflicts beyond all reason. Professor Kelder, an elderly Centaurian who had been quietly eating his midday meal, reached for his communication device. He had served as a mediator during the human first contact negotiations, and he recognized the signs of impending violence. Humans, he had learned, had a remarkable ability to turn any situation into a battlefield when they felt their moral code had been violated. Zektar made the first move, as Marcus had known he would. Bullies always struck first when they felt their authority being challenged. The Vorthin's crystalline fist came down in a perfect arc, fast enough to shatter normal bone, hard enough to crack stone. Marcus wasn't there to receive it. The human had moved left, sliding past the strike with an economy of motion that spoke of extensive training. His right hand came up to grab Zektar's extended arm, using the Vorthin's own momentum to pull him further off balance. At the same time, his left elbow drove up into the space where Zektar's ribs would be if he were human. Vorthins didn't have ribs exactly, but they did have a complex network of crystal formations that served a similar protective function. Unfortunately for Zektar, those formations were designed to protect against impact from the front or back, not from precisely applied force along their natural stress lines. The sound of cracking crystal filled the cafeteria as Zektar doubled over, his harmonic voice hitting frequencies that made several students cover their auditory organs. Mestak and Relkon moved simultaneously, trying to overwhelm the human with their combined assault. Marcus had been waiting for this. On Earth, he'd studied something called Krav Maga, a martial art developed by people who understood what it meant to be outnumbered and outgunned. The first rule was simple. There were no rules. The second rule was even simpler, and the fight as quickly as possible. Relkon reached him first, his crystalline claws extended to rake across Marcus's chest. The human dropped low, sweeping the Vorthin's legs while simultaneously driving his fist up into what passed for Relkon's solar plexus. The combination sent the alien tumbling backward into a nearby table, scattering food and drinks across a group of startled Rigelian students. Mestak had learned from his companion's mistakes and approached more cautiously, his natural armor plates shifting to protect his more vulnerable areas. But Marcus wasn't interested in a prolonged fight. This wasn't about proving his martial prowess. It was about sending a message. The human feinted left, then drove his shoulder into Mestak's midsection, lifting the taller alien off his feet and driving him backward into the wall. The impact was enough to crack the metal paneling and leave Mestak gasping for air through his crystalline respiratory system. In less than 30 seconds, it was over. 3 of the Federation's supposedly superior beings lay groaning on the cafeteria floor, their pride as shattered as Zektar's protective crystal formations. Marcus stood over them, not even breathing hard, his clothes barely disheveled. The silence in the cafeteria was deafening. Students from dozens of species stared at the human with a mixture of awe, fear, and something that might have been respect. This was why the established powers of the galaxy were nervous about humanity's rise. Not because they were technologically superior, but because they simply refused to accept that any challenge was insurmountable. Marcus turned away from the fallen Vorthans and walked over to where Kira still knelt on the floor. He extended his hand to help her up, his expression gentling as he looked down at her. "You okay?" he asked simply. Kira stared at his offered hand for a long moment, then slowly reached up to take it. His skin was warm, warmer than any Aqualian's, and surprisingly gentle for hands that had just dismantled 3 attackers with brutal efficiency. As she stood, Marcus looked down at the scattered remains of her meal, then back at her face. Without a word, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a meal voucher, one of the premium ones that allowed access to the station's more expensive dietary options. "This should cover replacement food, and then some," he said, pressing the voucher into her palm. "And next time someone gives you trouble, you come find me. Marcus Chun, quarters 7G in the human section." Kira stared at the voucher, then back at Marcus's face. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." Marcus looked around the cafeteria, at all the students who had watched the bullying without intervening, at the authority figures who had turned blind eyes to systematic harassment. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the silent space. "Because someone needs to." News of the cafeteria incident spread through Zephyr Station like wildfire. Within hours, every student, faculty member, and administrative official had heard some version of the story. The details grew more elaborate with each telling, but the core remained the same. A human had publicly humiliated 3 Vorthans in defense of an Aqualian girl. In the administrative offices of the station's upper levels, Dean Veltar paced behind his massive desk, his 4 arms gesticulating in agitation. The Zarathi administrator had held his position for over 20 standard years, maintaining order through careful diplomacy and strategic blindness to certain social dynamics. The incident in the cafeteria threatened to upset the delicate balance he had worked so hard to maintain. "Explain to me again how one human dismantled 3 of our most prominent students in under a minute," Veltar demanded, his compound eyes fixed on the security footage playing on his wall display. Security Chief Thorak, a massive Kroknari whose species served as peacekeepers throughout the Federation, watched the recording with something approaching professional admiration. "The human demonstrated advanced combat training, sir. His movements suggest military or specialized law enforcement background. Earth martial techniques are surprisingly effective." On the screen, Marcus's takedown of the 3 Vorthans played in slow motion. Every movement was precise, economical, designed to disable rather than kill. It was the kind of fighting that came from years of training combined with practical experience. "The Vorthans are demanding his immediate expulsion," Veltar continued. "They claim he assaulted them without provocation. Their families are threatening to withdraw funding from the cultural exchange program." Thorak's expression didn't change, but his tone carried a hint of skepticism. "The security footage shows the Vorthans destroying the Aqualian student's meal and attempting to force her to clean it from the floor. The human's intervention appears to be defensive in nature." "Defensive?" Veltar's voice rose to a higher pitch. "He put 3 students in the medical bay. with minor injuries that will heal within days, Thorak pointed out. A human trained in lethal combat could have done much worse. This appears to be a measured response designed to neutralize a threat while minimizing permanent damage. In the station's medical bay, the three Vorthans were indeed recovering from what the medical staff had classified as minor injuries. Their pride, however, would take considerably longer to heal. They huddled together in one corner of the facility, their crystalline skin still showing stress fractures from the encounter. "This isn't over," Zektar muttered, his harmonic voice distorted by the medical apparatus monitoring his respiratory functions. "No primitive mammal makes fools of us in front of the entire station." Relkon's skin flickered through angry reds and oranges. "Our families will hear about this. The Council of Vorthan will demand satisfaction. This human will learn what happens when you challenge your betters." But the threats felt hollow, even to themselves. They had learned something about humans in that cafeteria, something that the official Federation reports hadn't quite conveyed. Humans didn't fight like other species. They didn't posture or threaten or engage in ritualized combat. When they decided violence was necessary, they applied it with a clinical efficiency that was genuinely terrifying. Meanwhile, in the quieter sections of the station, word was spreading through very different channels. In the cramped quarters of the junior species students, those from worlds recently contacted or still considered developing, conversations took on a different tone entirely. "Did you see it?" whispered Jek Hai, a young Polarian whose fuzzy blue exterior hid a keen intelligence. The human didn't even hesitate. Three Vorthans, and he just walked right up to them. "My clutch mate was there," added Silmar, her insectoid features animated with excitement. She said the human's eyes never changed expression, not once during the entire fight. Like he was completely calm. In her small quarters in the Aqualian section, Kira sat on her sleeping platform, staring at the meal voucher Marcus had given her. The premium dining access it provided was worth more than she spent on food in an entire month, but its value went far beyond monetary consideration. It represented something she had never experienced before. Someone standing up for her simply because it was the right thing to do. Her communication console chimed softly, indicating an incoming message. She activated it with a gesture, and her family's image appeared in the holographic display. Her mother's concerned face looked back at her from across the vast distance that separated them. "Kira, dear Spawn, we received word about an incident at your station. Are you harmed?" Her mother's voice carried the musical undertones that made Aqualian speech so beautiful in its natural underwater environment. "I'm fine, birth mother," Kira replied, her own voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "There was trouble with some other students. But someone helped me." Her father appeared in the display, his more angular features showing the warrior caste heritage that had allowed their family to achieve its political position. "These others, were they Vorthans?" Kira nodded, knowing that her parents would understand the implications immediately. The Vorthans had been among the most vocal opponents of Aqualian admission to the Federation, arguing that ocean dwellers were too primitive for true civilization. "And this someone who helped you?" her mother asked gently. "A human. His name is Marcus Chun." Kira found herself smiling for the first time in days. "Birth mother, you should have seen it. He didn't even raise his voice. He just made them stop." Her parents exchanged glances that spoke of years of shared experience dealing with galactic politics. The Aqualians had learned to be cautious about forming alliances, especially with species as unpredictable as humans. But they also understood the value of having powerful friends. "This human," her father said carefully, "he asked for nothing in return?" "Nothing," Kira confirmed. "He gave me food credits and told me to find him if anyone bothered me again. He said someone needs to stand up for others." In his quarters, 3 levels up, Marcus was dealing with the aftermath of his decision in his own way. He sat at his desk, working on a report for his xenobiology class, when his door chimed. He opened it to find Professor Sarah Williams, the head of the Human Exchange Program and his unofficial mentor on the station. Professor Williams was in her 50s, with graying hair and the kind of sharp eyes that came from years of dealing with interstellar politics. She had been among the first human ambassadors to the Federation, and her diplomatic skills had helped smooth humanity's sometimes rocky integration into galactic society. "Marcus," she said, stepping into his quarters without invitation. "We need to talk." Marcus closed his tablet and gestured for her to take a seat. "I assume this is about the cafeteria incident." "The cafeteria incident where you hospitalized 3 students from one of the Federation's founding species." Williams's tone was carefully neutral. "Yes, that would be the one. They had it coming," Marcus said simply. "You should have seen what they were doing to that girl." "I did see. The security footage is quite clear." Williams leaned forward, her expression serious. "Marcus, I need you to understand the position this puts us in. Humans are still proving themselves in the galactic community. We can't afford to be seen as aggressors. So we should just stand by and watch bullying happen." Marcus's voice carried a hint of the steel that had been present in the cafeteria. "That's not who we are, Professor. That's not who I am." Williams sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I'm not saying you were wrong to intervene, but there were other ways to handle it. Diplomatic channels, formal complaints, working within the system. The system that has been ignoring this kind of harassment for months." Marcus leaned back in his chair. "Professor, with all due respect, sometimes the system is part of the problem. And sometimes," Williams replied quietly, "young humans with good intentions start galactic incidents that take years to resolve. The Vorthan Council is already making noise about this. They're calling it an unprovoked attack." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering her words. Finally, he looked up and met her eyes directly. "Professor, if I had to do it over again, I'd do exactly the same thing. Someone was being hurt, and I stopped it. If that makes me a problem for Human Federation relations, then maybe we need to examine what kind of relations we're trying to build." Williams studied his face, seeing the conviction there, the absolute certainty that he had done the right thing regardless of the consequences. It was, she realized, quintessentially human. Other species might calculate odds, consider political ramifications, weigh the costs of intervention against the benefits of neutrality. Humans just saw someone who needed help and helped them. "The dean wants to see you tomorrow morning," she said finally. "There's going to be a formal hearing about the incident." "I'll be there," Marcus replied. As Williams left, Marcus turned back to his desk and opened his communication console. He had a message waiting, sent through the station's internal system. It was from Kira, just 2 simple words in her carefully translated Aqualian script: "Thank you." The formal hearing room in Zephyr Station's administrative sector was designed to accommodate the diverse physiology of Federation species. Atmospheric controls could be adjusted for different breathing requirements. Gravity could be modified for comfort, and the lighting spectrum could be tuned to suit various visual systems. This morning, it was configured for what the administration termed standard galactic parameters, a compromise that left most species slightly uncomfortable, but no one completely unable to function. Marcus entered the chamber wearing his formal exchange student uniform, the simple blue and gray outfit that marked him as a representative of Earth's academic institutions. He had considered dressing more casually, but Professor Williams had advised him that showing respect for Federation legal processes might help his case. Dean Veltar presided over the hearing from an elevated platform, his 4 arms managing multiple data tablets as he reviewed the case files. To his left sat Counselor Jirax, a Vorthan elder whose crystalline features had been carved by centuries of political maneuvering. To his right was Ambassador Tlack of the Regelian Consortium, whose species served as neutral arbitrators in many Federation disputes. The chamber's gallery was surprisingly full. Word of the hearing had spread throughout the station, and students from dozens of species had come to observe the proceedings. Marcus noticed that the seating seemed to have naturally segregated itself, with students from the established Federation species on one side and those from newer or less influential worlds on the other. In the front row of the second group, Kira sat with her hands folded in her lap, her large dark eyes focused intently on the proceedings. Around her, Marcus recognized faces from the cafeteria incident, students who had watched the confrontation unfold but had been powerless to intervene. "This hearing is called to order," Dean Veltar announced, his voice amplified by the chamber's acoustic systems. "We are here to investigate the incident that occurred in Cafeteria 7 3 days ago, involving human exchange student Marcus Chun and Vorthan students Zektar, Relkon, and Mestak." Counselor Jirax leaned forward, his crystal formations catching the chamber's light and throwing prismatic patterns across the walls. "Before we begin, I must state for the record that the Vorthan Council views this incident as an unprovoked assault on 3 of our most promising young citizens. We expect appropriate sanctions to be imposed." Ambassador Tlak's expression remained neutral, but her large eyes tracked to Marcus with what might have been curiosity. The Rigelians were known for their analytical approach to conflict resolution, preferring to examine all evidence before forming conclusions. "Mr. Chun," Dean Veltar addressed Marcus directly, "you stand accused of assault against 3 fellow students. How do you respond to these charges?" Marcus stood, his posture straight but not defiant. "I respond that I defended someone who was being bullied and humiliated. If that constitutes assault under Federation law, then I'm guilty as charged." A murmur ran through the gallery at his direct response. Most students would have offered elaborate explanations or attempted to minimize their actions. Marcus's straightforward acceptance of responsibility was unexpected. "The security footage shows you initiating physical contact," Counselor Jirax stated coldly. "You struck first, without warning, against students who posed no threat to you personally. The security footage shows me intervening when 3 individuals were forcing another student to crawl on the floor and clean up food they had deliberately destroyed," Marcus replied calmly. "I would hardly characterize that as no threat." Dean Veltar activated a holographic display showing the security footage from the cafeteria. The recording played in real time, showing the escalating confrontation between the Vorthans and Kira, Marcus's approach, and the brief but decisive fight that followed. "As you can see," Marcus continued as the footage played, "I attempted verbal de-escalation first. I asked them to leave the young lady alone. They refused and became more aggressive. Physical intervention became necessary to protect someone who couldn't protect herself." Ambassador Tlak studied the footage carefully, her analytical mind processing every detail. "Mr. Chun, your species has a reputation for violent solutions to conflicts. How do we know this wasn't simply an expression of human aggression?" Marcus considered the question seriously before answering. "Ambassador, humans do have a capacity for violence. We evolved on a world where survival often depended on our ability to fight. But we also evolved something else, a sense of justice that compels us to protect those who cannot protect themselves. What you witnessed wasn't human aggression. It was human morality in action." In the gallery, several students shifted in their seats. The concept of fighting for moral reasons rather than personal gain was not unknown in Federation space, but it was rarely expressed so directly. "Morality?" Counselor Jirax's voice carried harmonics of disdain. "You speak of morality while committing acts of violence against students whose only crime was expressing their opinions about the natural order of civilized space." The chamber fell silent at those words. The natural order the counselor referenced was a touchy subject in Federation politics, representing the unofficial hierarchy that placed founding species above newer members and technological advancement above other forms of development. Marcus turned to face Counselor Jirax directly, his expression hardening. "Counselor, if your natural order includes forcing other beings to eat off the floor for the crime of being different, then I reject it completely. Where I come from, we fought wars to eliminate that kind of thinking." The tension in the chamber ratcheted up several notches. Marcus had just publicly challenged one of the core assumptions that governed Federation society, the idea that some species were naturally superior to others. "You dare compare Vorthan civilization to the primitive conflicts of your own world?" Jirax's crystal skin shifted to an angry red. "We have maintained peace and order in this galaxy for millennia while your species was still discovering fire. And yet," Marcus replied quietly, "my species never built a civilization based on making others feel inferior. We had our problems, our conflicts, our failures. But we learned that true strength comes from lifting others up, not pushing them down. Ambassador Tlack raised one slender hand, calling for order. Fascinating as this philosophical debate may be, we must focus on the facts of the case. Mr. Chun, do you deny that you physically assaulted 3 students? I deny that it was assault, Marcus replied. I used necessary force to stop an ongoing harassment situation and protect someone who was being victimized. In human legal terms, this would be classified as defense of others. Dean Veltar consulted his data tablets, scrolling through various legal precedents. The challenge we face is that Federation law regarding intervention in conflicts between students is somewhat ambiguous. While harassment is prohibited, so is unauthorized physical force. Perhaps, Ambassador Tlack suggested, we should hear from the alleged victim of this harassment. All eyes turned to Kira, who had been sitting quietly in the gallery. She stood slowly, her movements graceful despite her obvious nervousness. Miss Kira of Nereid Prime, Dean Veltar addressed her formally. Please approach the testimony platform. Kira walked to the center of the chamber, her blue skin darkening with the Aqualian equivalent of a blush. The attention of so many beings was overwhelming, but she forced herself to stand straight as she had been taught in the diplomatic protocols her family had drilled into her. Miss Kira, Ambassador Tlack said gently, please describe the events leading up to Mr. Chen's intervention. For a moment, Kira's voice stuck in her throat. Then, she looked at Marcus, saw the steady confidence in his eyes, and found her strength. They came to my table while I was eating. She began, her translated words carrying clearly through the chamber speakers. They called me names, said I was primitive, that I didn't belong here. When I asked them to leave me alone, they knocked over my food tray and told me to clean it up with my hands. They said, her voice wavered slightly, they said if I was lucky, they might let me lick it off the floor like the primitive I was. The gallery was completely silent now. Even the soft hum of the station's environmental systems seemed muted. They wanted me to crawl, Kira continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. To grovel for their amusement, to prove that they were right about my species being inferior. And I was going to do it because I was scared and alone and didn't know what else to do. She turned to look directly at Counselor Jirax, and for the first time since arriving at the station, there was fire in her dark eyes. Then, Marcus appeared. He didn't know me, had never spoken to me before, but he saw someone being hurt, and he stopped it. Not because it benefited him, not because of politics or species loyalty, but because it was the right thing to do. Kira's testimony hit the chamber like a shockwave. The casual cruelty she described, the systematic humiliation, the complete disregard for her dignity as a sentient being, it painted a picture that made many of the observers deeply uncomfortable. That is a very serious accusation, Dean Veltar said carefully. Mr. Zektar, Mr. Relcon, Mr. Mestak, how do you respond to these claims? The 3 Vorthans had entered the chamber during Kira's testimony, their crystal formations still showing stress fractures from their encounter with Marcus. Zektar stepped forward, his harmonic voice carrying undertones of barely controlled anger. We were engaged in standard social interaction with a junior species student, he said dismissively. If she perceived our guidance as harassment, that speaks to her inability to adapt to civilized standards. Guidance. Marcus's voice cut across the chamber like a blade. You call forcing someone to clean food off the floor with their hands guidance. Silence. Counselor Yinra commended. You have no right to speak while others are giving testimony. But the damage was done. Zektar's casual dismissal of Kira's humiliation as guidance had revealed the true nature of Vorthan attitudes toward newer Federation species. The mask of civilization had slipped, showing the ugly reality beneath. Ambassador Tlack studied all the participants carefully, her analytical mind processing the various testimonies and their implications. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of her position as neutral arbitrator. It appears we have 2 very different interpretations of the same events. The Vorthans claim they were providing guidance to help a newer species adapt to Federation standards. Mr. Chung claims he intervened to stop harassment and protect someone who was being victimized. She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. The question before us is not simply whether physical force was used, but whether it was justified under the circumstances. And that ultimately comes down to what kind of Federation we want to be. Ambassador Tlack's words hung in the air like a challenge, forcing everyone in the chamber to confront fundamental questions about the nature of their society. The silence stretched for long moments as beings from across the galaxy grappled with the implications of what they had heard. Dean Veltar was the first to speak, his forearms moving nervously as he processed the political ramifications of the hearing. Ambassador Tlack, while philosophical considerations are important, we must focus on the immediate legal questions. A student has used violence against other students. Federation regulations are quite clear about prohibited conduct. Are they? Tlack's large eyes fixed on the dean with laser focus. Section 47C of the Student Code specifically allows for intervention to prevent harm to others. The question is whether psychological and emotional abuse constitutes harm under Federation law. Consideres Cristal formations flashed angry rate. Emotional abuse? These are students learning to function in a diverse galactic society. Some adjustment difficulties are to be expected, especially from primitive species who lack proper social development. The word primitive seemed to echo through the chamber, and Marcus saw something shift in the faces of the students in the gallery. Representatives of dozens of species, many of whom had been on the receiving end of similar attitudes, began to sit straighter in their seats. "Counselor," Marcus said, standing to address the hearing panel directly, "I need to ask you something. When your own children were young, learning to navigate the world, did you teach them to solve problems by making others feel small? Did you tell them that their worth as beings came from their ability to humiliate those they saw as lesser? How dare you question Vorthan child-rearing practices?" Jirax's voice hit frequencies that made several species cover their auditory organs. "Your barbaric species has no understanding of proper civilization." "You're right," Marcus replied calmly. "We don't understand a civilization that's built on making others suffer. Where I come from, we have a saying, you can judge a society by how it treats its most vulnerable members." He gestured toward Kira, who was still standing at the testimony platform. "She came here to learn, to grow, to contribute to galactic society. Instead, she was systematically humiliated for the crime of being different. And when someone stood up for her, you call it assault." Professor Williams, who had been sitting quietly in the gallery, felt her heart racing as she watched Marcus speak. This was either going to be a disaster for human Federation relations or something unprecedented in the history of galactic politics. "Mr. Chin makes an interesting point," Ambassador Tlack observed. "The Federation was founded on principles of cooperation and mutual respect. Yet we seem to have developed an informal hierarchy that contradicts those founding ideals." She activated her own data tablet and projected a holographic display showing statistics from across Federation space. "Our records show that students from newer species have significantly higher dropout rates from exchange programs, higher rates of psychological stress, and lower academic performance despite meeting all entrance requirements. This pattern suggests systematic issues beyond individual adaptation difficulties." Dean Veltar studied the data with growing alarm. If these statistics became public, the implications for the Federation's education system would be enormous. "Ambassador, surely you're not suggesting that our entire educational framework is flawed?" "I'm suggesting that we may have confused maintaining order with maintaining justice," Tlack replied. "And Mr. Chin's actions, while technically violating conduct regulations, may have exposed a more serious violation of our fundamental values." In the gallery, students who had never spoken to each other before began to exchange glances, quiet words, shared understanding. A Polarian student whispered to a young Centaurian about her own experiences with harassment. A Rigelian nodded as an Andorian described the isolation of being constantly treated as inferior. Zektar, sensing that the hearing was not going as planned, stepped forward aggressively. This is ridiculous. We are the founding species of the Federation. We built this civilization while others were still crawling in mud. Our natural authority is not harassment. It's the order that keeps chaos at bay. Natural authority, Marcus repeated, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. You know, my species has some experience with that concept. We've had plenty of groups throughout our history who claim natural authority over others. We called them tyrants, oppressors, bullies. And eventually, we learned to fight back. He turned to face the entire chamber, addressing not just the hearing panel, but every student in the gallery. The question isn't whether I violated conduct regulations by using physical force. The question is whether we're going to build a federation where beings like Kira can pursue their dreams without being forced to crawl on the floor for someone else's amusement. The chamber erupted in discussion as students throughout the gallery began talking among themselves. Representatives of dozens of species found themselves agreeing with the humans' words, sharing experiences they had previously suffered in silence. Counselor Jirax looked around the chamber with growing alarm, realizing that the hearing had somehow transformed from a simple disciplinary matter into something approaching a revolution. Order, Dean Veltar called out, but his voice was barely heard over the growing buzz of conversation. We must maintain order. What? The question came from an unexpected source. Dr. Kethvar, an elderly Centaurian professor who had been observing from the faculty section. He stood slowly, his ancient frame carrying the dignity of centuries of scholarship. I have taught at this institution for over 200 years, Dr. Kethvar continued, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet chamber. I have watched thousands of students from hundreds of species pass through these halls, and I have watched too many bright young minds leave broken and defeated, not because they lacked ability, but because we allowed them to be systematically destroyed by those who confused cruelty with strength. He looked directly at Marcus, then at Kira, then at the three Vorthans who had started this entire incident. Today, for the first time in decades, I watched someone stand up and say no more. Not because regulations required it, not because it was politically expedient, but because it was morally necessary. The old professor's words carried weight that transcended species boundaries. Even Counselor Jirax seemed affected by the dignity and authority in his voice. Ambassador Tlack nodded slowly. Dr. Kethvar raises an important point. We have spent so much time maintaining the appearance of order that we may have forgotten what we were supposed to be ordering ourselves toward. She stood, her decision clearly made. After reviewing all testimony and evidence, I find that while Mr. Chun technically violated conduct regulations regarding physical altercations, his actions were justified under the Federation's fundamental principles of protecting the vulnerable and preventing abuse. Counselor Jirax shot to his feet, his crystal formations blazing with anger. This is outrageous. You cannot simply ignore Federation law because you approve of vigilante violence. I'm not ignoring Federation law, Tlack replied calmly. I'm interpreting it in light of Federation values. Mr. Chin's actions prevented ongoing harm to a fellow student. His use of force was proportional and designed to stop the threat, not cause unnecessary damage. She turned to address Marcus directly. However, Mr. Chun, I must caution you that future incidents of this nature should be reported through proper channels before resorting to physical intervention. Marcus met her gaze steadily. Ambassador, with all due respect, if I see someone being hurt and I have the power to stop it, I'm going to stop it. I'll deal with the consequences afterward. A ripple of approval ran through the gallery at his words. Students from dozens of species saw something in the humans' unwavering moral stance that spoke to their own hopes and values. Dean Veltar, recognizing the shifting political winds in the chamber, cleared his throat nervously. In light of Ambassador Tlack's ruling, I hereby dismiss all charges against Mr. Chun. However, I am implementing new protocols for reporting and addressing harassment between students. And the Vorthan students? Dr. Kethvar asked pointedly. Veltar looked uncomfortable. They will receive counseling on appropriate interspecies relations and will be required to attend sensitivity training. It wasn't enough, and everyone in the chamber knew it. But it was a start, a crack in the facade that had allowed systematic abuse to flourish unchallenged. As the hearing officially concluded, students throughout the gallery began to approach Marcus and Kira. Species that had rarely interacted before found themselves united by shared experiences and newfound hope. Kira, still somewhat overwhelmed by the attention, found herself at the center of a growing group of students from newer Federation species. For the first time since arriving at the station, she didn't feel alone. "What happens now?" she asked Marcus as the chamber slowly emptied. Marcus looked around at the diverse group of students who had gathered around them, representing dozens of worlds and species united by a simple idea, that everyone deserved to be treated with dignity. "Now we build something better," he said simply. "We show them what the Federation could be instead of what it has been." In the weeks that followed, the incident in Cafeteria 7 became known throughout Federation space as the Stand. Not because of the violence that occurred, but because of the moment when someone finally said no more to systematic oppression. Students from dozens of species began forming study groups, support networks, and advocacy organizations. The informal hierarchy that had governed station life began to crumble as beings refused to accept their assigned places in the social order. The Vorthans and other founding species found themselves increasingly isolated as their attitudes were challenged not by rebellion, but by a simple insistence on basic respect and dignity. Marcus continued his studies, but found himself becoming an informal leader of what some called the dignity movement. He never sought the role, but when others looked for someone who would stand up for what was right regardless of the consequences, they found him ready. Kira thrived in the new environment, her natural intelligence and talent finally able to flourish without the constant pressure of harassment. She and Marcus became close friends, bonded by the moment when one being's willingness to help another changed both of their lives forever. And throughout the Federation, on stations and world across known space, the story spread. The story of how one human with a simple moral code had reminded an entire civilization what it meant to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Because sometimes the most important thing you can do is hold someone's beer and stand up for what's right.